cozy up here. Too many of us.
Yeah. Dan, that's Patrick.
Okay, good. For the opening.
You're gonna give me your multicolored pen, right? Oh, let me get it for you. Someone stole my pen. There's no house.
Should I wait for things? I'm gonna wait for things to calm down a little bit.
No notes.
I'm gonna go ahead and
It's all in here.
I wouldn't embarrass myself in front of Mayor Kelly. I didn't.
yeah. If we could get folks to take their seats so we could get started, please.
My usual skin. Do I look a little bit?
Thanks, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the forum at Harvard University. I'm Dan Miller, a student here at the Kennedy School and your moderator for tonight's discussion. Thank you, all right. It's a good audience. Actually, it reminds me of a quick story. If folks will indulge me for 1 second. As people know, I used to work for a senator. About a year ago, I was before a fairly large audience, substituting for my boss at a community forum in sort of a southern rural part of the state. Well, as people know, I also work for a fairly liberal Democratic senator. So it was an interesting evening ahead of me. As I began to speak, a guy in the back said, "We can't hear you." At which point a woman, literally in the front row, leapt to her feet, pointed to him and said, "I'll trade places with you." So you guys are a bit friendlier than that. The title for tonight's program is, Will the Democratic or Republican Agenda Lead America into the Future? The format is somewhat different than what many of you are used to. The idea here tonight is not simply for you to listen to a series of political speeches. Rather, what we have envisioned is part debate and part town hall meeting. You will hear from some of your fellow students, you will hear from two of our distinguished members of the Institute of Politics, but you, the audience, will also contribute. In fact, as we have crafted the program, the audience has a central role, and we strongly encourage any who are interested to participate. My job, in part, is to ensure that our student panelists, none of whom have been accused of being short-winded, do not get too carried away and consume time dedicated for all of you. We'll begin with 5-minute opening statements by each side, followed by a 5-minute rebuttal. We will then turn to the audience for their questions, comments, and statements. We ask only that those who do speak limit their remarks to less than 1 minute. Following comments from the audience, each side on the panel will have an opportunity to make a brief response. To facilitate balanced input from the audience, we have set up 2 microphones. If you want to challenge the Democrats and anything they've said, please use this microphone. If you want to challenge the Republicans, please use this microphone. If you don't align yourself with a party or you want to challenge both parties, feel free to use either microphone. We will close the program with concluding remarks by each side. Before getting started, I want to take a minute to introduce our panelists. First, starting on the Republican side, right next to me is John Shaw. Last November, John ran for Congress in Michigan's 13th Congressional District. While he didn't win the election, he certainly shook some people up as a higher percentage voted Republican in the 13th District than ever before. Before making his bid for Congress, John served in the Bush administration, first as Associate Director for Domestic Policy, later as Chief of Staff for former Labor Secretary Lynn Martin. One brief final comment about John. He's a 1984 graduate of the Kennedy School. For those of you graduating in June, there is some hope. Next to John is Jim Haskell. Jim graduated from Franklin and Marshall College in 1990. Subsequently went to work for the American Enterprise Institute. In 1992, Jim left AEI for Caxton Corporation, where he worked primarily with their hedge fund operation. Last semester, Jim helped co-found the Harvard chapter of the Concord Coalition. Next to Jim, we have John Simon. John is a 1990 graduate of Princeton. Following Princeton, he went to work for AMP Incorporated as a management consultant. Among his numerous activities at the Kennedy School, John chairs the Republican Student Caucus. To my left, we have the Democrats. First, we have Sharon Pratt Kelly. Most recently, Ms. Kelly served as mayor of the District of Columbia from 1990 to 1995. She's both the first woman to serve as mayor of the district and the first African-American woman elected mayor of any major U.S. city. Ms. Kelly was also elected to 4 terms as a committee woman to the Democratic National Committee and served as treasurer of the DNC from 1985 to 1989. Prior to assuming the office of mayor, Ms. Kelly was vice president at the Potomac Electric Power Company. Next to Ms. Kelly, we have Rudy Barnes. Rudy is a 1990 graduate of the University of Virginia. After graduating, he spent 4 years on Capitol Hill working for longtime South Carolina Congressman John Pratt, principally doing environmental and transportation policy. At the Kennedy School, Rudy chairs the environment pick and will serve as a class advisor in next year's MPP1 class. Finally, we have Dimitri Melhorn. Dimitri is a Stanford graduate, where he compiled an impressive record as a college debater. After Stanford, Dimitri helped found an organization called the Bay Area Day Schools, where he also worked as an instructor. Dimitri graduates this June and is off to Yale Law School in the fall. Congratulations, Dimitri. So, without further ado, I think it's time for us to get started. According to the schedule that I have, the Republicans will be first, and I understand that Mr. Shaw will begin.
Thank you, Dan, and I want to thank the Kennedy School Democratic Caucus and the Kennedy School Republican Caucus for sponsoring this debate, giving us an opportunity to talk about America's future, and I'm proud to be able to participate in it, and proud to be up here as one of the water carriers for the Republican side. But before I start tooting the horn for the Republican victory, I'm going to begin with a somewhat modest confession. Somewhat unusual, I suspect, for a politician to say that. But in a few years in the business, what I realized is that neither side, and I say this truly, my brothers and sisters on the Republican side, have no more claim to divine revelation than my colleagues on the Democrat side of the aisle. And for those of you here tonight who are looking for the eternal verities, maybe you want to go over to the philosophy department because you're not going to find it in this school, that democracy is instead really a process of discovery. In some sense, an endless process of discovery. But it's exactly that process of discovery that makes me believe, right now in 1995, the Republican agenda moves America to a much better future. The reason I say that is because we as a Republican Party are engaged in a process of discovery ourselves right now. Really, a process of rediscovery. Rediscovery of our roots as a party. Our roots as the party of Lincoln. As the party of Lincoln, rediscovering our roots as the party of individual opportunity and the party of freedom. That's why 1995 is so important. The debate in 1995 has become one that really speaks to what is the fundamental nature of American government and the scope and reach of American government today. The debate in 1995 is, I think, is an important one that you've seen in this century. We've only seen in a few other years in this century. 1935, certainly. 1965 with the Great Society. In some sense, 1981 with the Reagan Revolution. And now, 1995. A question of bigger government versus smaller government. For those of you who want bigger government, you probably want to buy the Democrats' prescription. But for those of us Americans who want smaller government, who want less intrusive government, certainly the Republican prescription is the one that moves America to a better future. Our agenda is one to break the shackles of the reliance on big statist approach to government, an approach that has failed in the last 30 years. In breaking the shackles of the state, we as Republicans do not aim to replace the failed social engineering of the left with some new social engineering of the right. Quite the contrary, to reduce the role of government in our lives. We seek to break the shackles, really the shackles on our future, imposed by the federal budget deficit, one that gives America far less secure a future economically and for the next generation. We also seek to break the shackles of dependency that a welfare state in this country in the last 30 years has created, that has created a culture of reliance, a culture of dependency, really, let's admit it, has created a permanent underclass in America, depriving millions of Americans the opportunity to participate in the American economic mainstream, denying them the opportunity for the American dream. So we as Republicans seek to create instead, as Jack Kemp phrases it, an opportunity society, a society of genuine opportunity for all Americans. In doing so, we're founding an agenda really on three principles: a principle of budget responsibility, of federalism, and of democratic accountability. The first, with budget responsibility, taking seriously, finally, getting our deficit down and getting to a balanced budget. A budget deficit that mortgages our children's future, and replacing that with one that gives us economic security for the next generation. I'm glad this is about which agenda is better, because I still haven't heard what the Democrat agenda is on this. Those who say 2002 is too quick, maybe 2005, that's not an agenda, that's an excuse. Republicans have done the politically courageous thing to do, talking about getting to a balanced federal deficit. Secondly, with respect to federalism, is sharing power with state and local governments, really returning to what our founding fathers dreamed for American government, an American government with a national government, but with strong state and local governments. We as the party of state and local governments want to turn some of that power back, not because the states have all the answers. They don't. Part of the reason we're in this debate in 1995 is because we realize we don't have the answers. It really is an exercise in modesty. The states won't have all the answers either. But through experimentation and governing closest to where the people are, we'll get some better answers for the future that we can use nationally. So returning power to state and local governments, and of course, that's why we did in the first few days, got rid of unfunded mandates from the federal level. And lastly, accountability. Returning fundamental democratic accountability into the American political system. This is not a trivial matter. On September 27th, 386 of us stood on the steps of the United States Capitol and signed our names to the contract with America. We didn't just make campaign promises, we signed on the dotted line. We did exactly what American voters told us they wanted to do. Forget the usual, politics as usual negative campaigning. Tell us what you stand for and let us decide. That's exactly what we as a Republican Party did, built accountability back into this system, signed our names on the dotted line, and let the American people decide. They did decide in 1994, and they get to hold us accountable in 1996. It's returning to that model, almost the party program models that you see in the British government, that we have not seen in American government for decades. That's returning accountability to the system. It's exactly what we did. It's on these principles, democratic accountability, budget responsibility, and shared power, that we as a Republican Party intend to move America to a better future, a future that's a genuine opportunity society for all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Mayor Kelly's doing the opening for the Democrats.
Well, I too want to thank everyone for the opportunity to participate in this forum. It's a needed debate and dialogue that I think will serve our country better. And I too want to say, John, it's been a privilege to share this experience with you here at the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics. But when we talk about where we are and where we're going as a country, and indeed which of the two parties or any party is best equipped to carry us into the real promise of America, I think it's very interesting that depending upon what slice of America you talk to or listen to, as to whether they call it the contract for America or the contract on America. And I think that speaks volumes about the philosophy and the thrust of the party in power today. I'd be the first to acknowledge that we are a country in desperate need of reform. I'd be the first to recognize that we do need to have government downsized. We need to continue that process. We do need to automate our government. We do need to reorganize our government. We do need to rethink even the role of government. And as such, we do need to rethink and debate such issues as welfare and the like. But that is only the superficial conversation that is occurring. Most Americans recognize the real undercurrents of what is occurring. It is the apostles of divide and conquer. It is wedge politics. The apostles too often even of hate. There are an awful lot of Americans who are genuinely frightened and shaken. America is at a very different juncture in her history. There was a time when there was stability in the family, and that is no longer necessarily the order of the day. There was a time when you thought that if you worked hard, you got a good education, you had a secure job. Certainly if you were a white male in America. But that is no longer the order of today. With all of the explosion in technology, with all of the competition in what is now a global marketplace, no one's job is secure, no one's future is secure. Now, I can think of a time right in Washington, D.C. when you saw folks moving about on bicycles. They would be delivering mail and messages. Along came a little piece of technology called a fax, and now it's a verb. You don't see those folks anymore, you fax it. You don't deliver it by way of a bike. The new technology that once allowed us to liberate us is also now a technology that sometimes threatens our own job security. And in such an environment where people are shaken to the core, if you cannot offer them a legitimate debate, as I believe the Republicans have failed to do, what you offer them is the fact that if I can't offer you a message on how to struggle with some of these many changes, at least I will give you a quick fix solution. And my quick fix solution is don't worry about it. I'm not going to let that other person move forward. And that is so much of what is involved in the debate around affirmative action. It is nothing but wedge politics. For someone to even suggest when 95% of all of the major jobs in corporate America are still in the hands of white men, that affirmative action is the reason why somebody doesn't have a job has got to border on a joke. The fact that somebody would suggest that the reason that there's instability in our society is that there are just far too many women who are moved to a different kind of role is also irresponsible. This kind of message that is being advanced by the Republican Party can only put us on a perilous course and can only lead to the possibility of a nation that could indeed implode. We do need to have legitimate discussion, and the place we're going to get that discussion is in the Democratic Party, because it is the one party that believes in the American dream. It is the one party that really holds true and dear the basic principles of this country, which is that you don't have to be to the manner born, but through the hard work and dint of your labor, you can have a chance to participate in the American dream. And if there's anything for which the country still suffers from, is that she has not always been true to it. But the Democratic Party is the one party that is still the arbiter and the believer and the protector of that great vision for this country. We need as a nation to get back to the principles that once made us strong, but we won't get there with division and hate. We do need to rediscover what it is to have the work ethic. We do need to rediscover what it is to invest in our future. But to invest in our future is not to divide and to conquer today. To invest in our future is to hold everyone accountable. And that means investing in our children. The reason any of us enjoy the prosperity we enjoy today is because we enjoyed a generation that was gladly sacrificed so that we might do better. And far too many of my generation are prepared to mortgage your future as against making that investment, and would rather point the finger as against to learn from the message of Shakespeare. The answer does not lie within the stars, but in ourselves. We need to be reconnected to the basic principles that made America great. I believe the Democratic Party still has that vision. I believe the Democratic Party still has that dream. I believe this is the one party that believes in the real beauty of this country, a mosaic of many. The best expression of what the world is about, because we have a little piece of all the planet right here in America, and it is the one party that cherishes that. The future of America is with the Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mary Kelly. Providing the Republican response will be Jim Haskell.
Thank you, Dan. Mayor Kelly, let me thank the Kennedy School of Government and also the both caucuses. Mayor Kelly, when I listen to your talk just now, I get confused because I think that you have outlined the problems of this society very well. Unfortunately, since we're not sure what agenda you're putting forth, I don't know whether your prescriptions, what they are, and so I can only tell you that the Republican prescriptions, it seems to me, are the ones that will start to make the inroads to the very problems that you laid out. For example, you talked about the problem of divide and conquer. I think what you mean by that is a disunity that's going on in this society, in our inner cities, even outside of our inner cities. And I would point to the fact that part of the problem is our affirmative action policies right now. While well-intentioned and maybe even useful in the past, we are now to the point where affirmative action policies are dividing us by race, by gender, and causing resentments which I think cause anger, which we saw in last November's elections. I am not suggesting that we should impose policies that that somehow would let discriminatory practices in the corporate sector take place. I'm simply suggesting that quotas and racial preferences are outdated and wrong. Now, you might have seen in the New York Times just this past Sunday an article entitled "Way Beyond the Glass Ceiling," in which a lot of female and minority female executives were highlighted. And in fact, there were the article stressed that this movement was in fact progressing. That's the kind of article that suggests that times are in fact changing. If your policies have served us well, now we must move on to others which create what John talked about, the opportunity society. Now this goes to the issue of welfare reform in the inner city. When we try to social engineer through government, what we end up doing is spending a lot of the money that we initially, well-intentioned, put out for these inner cities to government bureaucracy. For example, in 1994, $89 billion that was directed for the health care for Medicaid and Medicare went through HUD. $16 billion of that never was received by any of the recipients of Medicaid or Medicare. $9 billion that went through for enterprise or type-like zones for poor people to get housing. $9 billion went to the landlords through HUD. Only 30% of the money directed to the poor got there. Only 30% in the form of direct form of income payments were received. Where does all the rest of the money go? How could we better do it? We could better do it through what Jack Kemp talks about, through enterprise zones. Enterprise zones by themselves don't work, we know, but in combination with the proper social policies, policies that don't reward single mothers and the breakup of the family, in those combinations, enterprise zones might be more successful. Now, with regards to the budget deficit, your prescriptions, again, are short because the budget deficit is the critical issue if we want to invest in our nation's future. It is interesting to me that Laura Tyson, formerly the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, warns the White House line right now, which is Republicans don't cut the budget deficit in 7 years, don't eliminate it, because that's going to put us into recession. This is the very same woman that said to us in 1993 that cutting the budget deficit is absolutely necessary for the economic future of this country because it will bring down interest rates. She's right. And by the way, high budget deficits and high interest rates help the wealthy. For those of you that might participate sometimes, perhaps unintentionally, in the class warfare line, it is the budget deficit and high interest rates for the savers of this country, which are high-income people, that benefit. We need to cut the budget deficit, and we need to do it now. Now, the $1 trillion plus that the Republicans in both plans came out with last week is 2.6% of the output of this projected output of this economy in the next 7 years. 2.6%. That's it. This is not an economic crisis, it's a political crisis. It's a crisis in which the government can't do what it wants to do until now. And it is the Republicans that made it happen since last November, because it's Republicans that have the spine to go up there and hit the ball out of the ballpark. Now, I know there's one weakness, by the way, Mayor Kelly, and I expect to hear it from Mr. Barnes. And I would suggest that this is a weakness of the Republican Party, and we come up here as Republicans pushing our party for the right positions, and that weakness is that we need to do more to cut corporate subsidies, corporate taxes. Excuse me, not cut them, but make them fair and cut these corporate subsidies. Because if we're going to cut government subsidies to the poor, we must do so for all sectors of the economy. Now, I would suggest to you that while I know you're going to mention it, that in fact next week, the Cato Institute, a think tank down in Washington with strong ties to the House leadership in particular, has a report entitled Ending Corporate Welfare as We Know It, citing 129 subsidies totaling $87 billion. And we expect movement with the real support of House Majority Leader Dick Armey to get these down. Now, maybe down the road sometime, but we as Republicans need to do that as well. And I'll stop there because I know we're going to have questions, interact sessions. There's more to go, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jim. Now, Rudy, you're up.
Well, I have, excuse me, good news and bad news. The good news is that I'm not going to explode at Jim. That's also the bad news. And I'm not going to explode. I want to address a couple of specific points that Jim made and then try to tie them into a broader strategy and echo some of the themes that Mayor Kelly mentioned. First of all, on a specific issue that Jim raised, saying we're past the time for quotas and preferences, I have to question that assertion when we can still say in 1995 that 90%, actually I believe it might be 95% of senior executive and management positions in the private sector in this country are held by people with my gender and skin color. I think as the percentage of minorities grows and women enter the workforce, it's really ridiculous that that's still the case. And to say that, it's one thing to say we need to rethink affirmative action, but to say there's no longer a problem, I think it flies in the face of the facts. On a second issue, another sort of specific point, Jim brought up something that Republicans, particularly in the House, are really talking a lot about, and that's devolving power to the states. Last week, Lawton Chiles, who is a Democrat and actually won in '94, so he's kind of a rare bird, spoke to the National Press Club and pointed out one of the big flaws with the Republican plan to turn a lot of federal programs into block grants. What the House would do is lock in at 5% current spending block grants to the states for things like welfare and Medicaid. Chiles pointed out that what this plan would do is provide states like Massachusetts and Wisconsin, who oddly enough have Republican governors, with roughly $3,800 and $4,000 respectively per child, that amount of funding for the Medicaid and welfare programs. And a state like Florida, which has done a good job of lowering its spending on welfare, would get about $2,000 per child. It would lock that in for 5 years. And Chiles is making the argument, I think it's a good one, that you're going to have, when governors start looking more at this, growth states and states that have already reduced the amount they spend on welfare and Medicaid are going to be locked in at 5 years at a drastically lower level of spending per child and per Medicaid recipient than states that have not done such a good job. And so if Tommy Thompson and Will Weld like the Republican block grant proposal, don't be so surprised. On another specific point, and this is going to lead me into my broader themes, Jim has talked about something that I think there's probably consensus about on the panel, and that is deficit reduction and the need for it. I'd point out, first of all, that Bill Clinton did a pretty good job of starting the deficit reduction path. I, like a lot of others, take issue with his most recent budget, but the $400+ billion worth of deficit reduction that came out of his '93 budget reconciliation, that was achieved with no Republican support whatsoever. And in fact, the current plans, in some respects, are similar to that. So I don't think Republicans can assume the mantle of deficit reduction all by themselves. But the larger point is simply, where do their cuts come, and how do they get deficit reduction? Where are their priorities? One of the reasons that I'm a Democrat and not a Republican is that while on specific policy issues I may not be so far apart from a Jim Haskell, a John Simon, or a John Shaw, when it comes to something like economic justice and equity issues, we part company. Republicans simply don't seem to care about equity. The United States has the greatest income and wealth inequality in the industrialized world. It's not getting any better. Last week, Leon Panetta in a press conference pointed out that between 1979 and 1993, the wage gap between high school graduates and college graduates went from 39% to 80%. What's the Republican response? Cut student loans, cut Head Start, make it harder to get an education, harder to get job training, harder to get a student loan. That doesn't sound to me like investing in the future. Secondly, while Pete Domenici has been wise enough not to build a tax cut in the immediate future in the Senate budget plan, in the House there's $350 billion worth of tax cuts. Where do those tax cuts go? First of all, capital gains tax cuts. Anyone that just came out of Jim Hines' review session ought to remember that capital gains wealth is held exclusively almost by the wealthiest in America. Cut capital gains and you help the top 1%, maybe the top 5% of income earners and wealth holders in this country. That shows to me the Republicans don't care about equity issues. Secondly, in both budgets, Republicans would cut back the earned income tax credit. This is the only thing right now in the United States tax code that amounts to a tax break for the working poor. These are not welfare recipients. These are people who work and make less than $25,000 or $27,000 a year, families earning that level. Both Republican budgets cut that back. That is a tax increase. They don't want to own up to this, but this is a tax increase on the working poor simultaneous with a tax break for families earning up to $200,000 a year. Let me end up talking a little bit again about another sort of specific angle to take when you're talking about investment in the future. I think my point with the deficit is you can bring it down and have different priorities in how you bring it down. But look at an issue like the environment, where the Republicans' line right now is to roll back the Clean Water Act, which has made rivers like the Cuyahoga in Ohio and Love Canal in New York, has cleaned those places up. They want to roll back the Clean Water Act. They want to reform Superfund and make it a lot more difficult to come up with the funds to clean up Superfund sites. Amazingly enough to me, they actually want to slash the Department of Energy's nuclear waste cleanup budget. Now this is interesting because a lot of the nuclear waste that's out there in our nation's nuclear weapons complex is a result of the massive defense buildup that occurred under Ronald Reagan. So now we've got a multi-billion-dollar problem that Undersecretary Charles Curtis pointed out when he was here at the Kennedy School 3 weeks ago that's not going away. I guess the Republicans want to fence off these vast areas and say, sorry kids, no ball fields over there. But they want to pretend the problem's going to go away on its own and slash funds for that. That sounds to me not like a party that's interested in the future, but a party that's interested in short-term turnaround, short-term gain, with no view toward the future. Finally, I'm going to set Dimitri up, who's going to close later for us, by talking a little bit about another reason I'm a Democrat and have problems with the Republican Party, and it has to do with something we're going to call political demagoguery. The Republican Party has done a great job, and I think Newt Gingrich deserves a lot of credit for this, for being very strategy-minded, being strategic. He set out about 15 years ago to purposefully and self-servingly undermine public faith in government. He sought to destroy confidence specifically in Congress so that Republicans could take over. It was a slash and burn strategy, and it has worked. The irony, of course, is that it may make it harder for Republicans to govern. The point I'm trying to make is that the Republicans have sown cynicism, have made it harder for government to function, and that is to the detriment of us all. Now that they have the opportunity to lead, I'm crossing my fingers because I have my doubts. Thanks.
Thank you, Rudy. We will now turn to the audience segment of tonight's event. Again, if you have questions, comments, statements, you want to direct those to the Democrats, please line up at this microphone over here. If you have similar questions for the Republican side, please line up over here, and we will alternate between them. No one rush to the microphones.
Short debate.
Yep. You want to go? Yeah, Jim, go ahead, please.
Before Mark gets up there, I just want to respond one thing about cynicism.
That's not part of the format, Jim. That's not part of the format.
right.
Regular order, please.
Hi, who bet 20 minutes on them blowing up at each other? Was that Scott?
Okay. Now, we're going to go, now that we have some folks here. Please.
Oh, okay. This is for both parties if they choose to answer it. During the NAFTA debate, both parties made the contention that the future of America lies with this global economy and this global marketplace. This morning, Mickey Cantor of the Clinton administration announced $6 billion in trade sanctions against Japan. Where do both parties stand on the issue of getting America into the marketplace, keeping jobs in this country, and not exporting jobs, but exporting products?
Well, I, for one, think that we need to place a heavier premium on this, and I think a lot of that, however, we have to look to our own American corporations. You know, I've come out of the private sector. I did that more than I did government, and I believe in the capitalist system. But if we're to give tax breaks to our own corporations, then they need to have a commitment to the American people. We give them tax breaks, but they don't necessarily reinvest any of that benefit in training and their own workforce and a commitment to this country. I think that we need to have a stronger partnership, in spirit at least, with our own companies and this country, which is more in the spirit of how other countries function, particularly Japan.
I think when you think about free trade and the issues of free trade and fair trade, you have to ask yourself, what is trade? Trade is people making a deal for their mutual benefit. We wouldn't trade with Japan if we weren't getting something out of it, and Japan wouldn't trade with us if they weren't getting something out of it. We've actually gotten the better part of the deal from a social benefit cost analysis point of view, because we have the Japanese producing relatively inexpensive products for us, increasing our purchasing power. I think the Republican Party has probably had its proudest moments in the last few years before the Contract of America when it supported President Clinton in NAFTA, and throughout the 1980s when it pushed very hard for free trade. I think Japan does practice managed trade, and I think it's to their detriment. That's why Japan is in such political chaos right now. I think that if America wants to move forward and wants to be the economy of the future, we have to utilize our competitive advantages and utilize other countries' competitive advantages for us. An example we have to think about is a few years ago, very within my memory, people were bemoaning the loss of America's manufacturing base and saying this is a horrible thing, this will make us so uncompetitive in the future. Today we are one of the powerhouses in the knowledge-based, non-manufacturing industries, and the richest countries in the world are all knowledge industries, not manufacturing industries. It is the poorer countries who are becoming the manufacturers for those countries that produce and manage and sell knowledge.
Thank you. I'm going to remind our panelists, please keep your responses brief. The next question.
I missed the first couple of statements, so I...
You didn't miss anything.
Okay. Well, cut me off if...
That's just not true.
Cut me off if this has been, if you've already answered this, and I'll get the notes from someone. But the biggest problem I see with block grants is that they wouldn't soften the business cycles the way entitlements do. And so I'm curious how the Republicans would address that specific problem with going to block grants, because I definitely understand some of the benefits you'd have of a block grant, of local administration, of a state knowing better than a federal government what it needs and what it can benefit from. But, go ahead.
Sure. It's a good analytic point, and even in the less than sophisticated debate that's occurred in the last 3 months, the point came up and it has been somewhat addressed. The Republicans have built in, there's not another word for it, we don't have a better term for it yet, a rainy day fund for cyclical downturns to augment funds to states in economic downturn years for those block grant programs. Yes, it will happen, absolutely, there's no question about it. And there has to be a rainy day fund. This is not too unusual. We don't do a lot of it at the federal level. It happens at the state level all the time. In the federal experience, there's basically only one major program where we do it, and that's the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, where there is an additional fund in case with economic downturn you deplete the fund. So we have realized we have to build in something of that sort for those programs that are going to be block granted as we move from the years out. So absolutely, it's an analytic point, it's a good one, and yes, it will be addressed.
Can I just follow up? Do you go into deficit spending to do it, or do you build up a fund ahead of time? I wasn't clear what.
I don't think the details have been worked out. Right now, nobody has the money to put in ahead of time to build up a fund. So basically what would happen would be an additional federal appropriation in those years.
Thanks.
The Democratic side has opted not to respond to this one, so we'll go to our next question.
I have a question for the Democratic side. When you were speaking, Mayor Kelly, you referred to the Republicans as being in power. Now, the last time I checked, the Democrats were still in the White House, and there is some power there. But I would agree with you that the Republicans have completely captured the debate, and that they now set the terms for what we talk about. The two responses, or your opening and the response, were also pretty much a response to the Republicans. I'd like someone from your side, and maybe this is coming up later, to talk about how the Democrats recapture the debate and start to talk about what the Democrats plan to do about issues like equity and the other principles that you've talked about. We don't have a contract with America, for America, or on America from the Democrats, and I think that that is going to be a serious problem in the elections coming up if the party is going to simply posture itself as being opposed to what the Republicans are doing.
I, for one, did not, in terms of my opening remarks, when I was talking about the basic values and principles of this country, I was not really talking about what I thought was the Republican discussion at all. Indeed, I was talking about what I think have always been the basic principles of the Democratic Party. As to whether the Democratic Party has solidly found her voice or not, I think that is a debatable point. I think in part, however, that the reason the Democratic Party struggles with it is because the country is at such a tough crossroads in her history. We are a nation that has, for the first time, been shaken, at least in a very long time. My generation that came into power recently lived through an unprecedented era in American history, where life got better year after World War II. And we actually came to expect that of our country. And it's very tough to wrestle with these tough issues of long-term investment, commitment to the future, sacrifice today so that life might be better in the future for a generation that has been as indulged as ours. But I believe the Democratic Party still nonetheless is wrestling with that now. It is the party that does believe in retraining America. You can't just talk about a nation that has moved towards a knowledge-based economy unless you also have a commensurate commitment to training so that the lion's share of the American people are the beneficiaries. There ought not to ever be a discussion of any kind of tax break unless there's a corollary discussion of a commitment to reinvest in that workforce and in the American people. There cannot be a discussion about America's future unless there's an equal commitment to Head Start, daycare, tuition assistance for our young people, and education generally. The only place that debate is going on, the only place you hear that voice is in the Democratic Party. I don't suggest that it is always the clearest, most consistent voice, but it is the only place that you even hear an utterance about an investment in America's future. The Republican Party is in no ways talking about it. It talks about only how we can be enriched for the moment. It in no ways is talking about a real commitment to investing in America's future, particularly a new generation. So, no, not from my vantage point was I talking about what the Republicans are saying. By no means do I suggest that they are in any way in any way speaking to those things that I think the Democratic Party is about and that I'm talking about.
Dan, may
I understand the Republicans like to respond.
Mayor Kelly, maybe you weren't aware, but in 1992, actually a bill that John Shaw worked on was the assets bill for the very purpose of employee retraining. I don't know where that lack of attention on the Republican chart, the accusation about that came from. But more told on a philosophical level, we don't agree. We don't agree that government is the place always for retraining or other areas. I talked with Amy Solomon the other day about the incentive for corporations to get better workers. And to get better workers, they need more educated workers. And one of the things that they need there is better schools. And all this fits in a chain of why all these things are breaking down right now. And I would suggest that the private sector may be the place to turn in many cases. School choice. I know many people are against this, but at least this should be on the table. What role does the private sector, what role can it play in education? And I think we need to talk about that. That should be on the agenda. That talk is happening in the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party, as I can see. And as far as this equity issue, you know, it's always the case that the Democrats are for equity and the Republicans aren't. But always when we get into equity, then we have these differences of opinion. Well, equity for this group, equity for this group. We got to spend on this group, and we got to spend on this group. And no one wants to say, well, we can't. No, we can't spend. We got to cut our spending if we want to invest in everybody. I mean, just today in Washington, I want to read you this quote. President Clinton. This was found by some opposition researchers, I guess, in the Republican Party. President Clinton in 1993 said, quote, "Today, Medicaid and Medicare are going up at 3 times the rate of inflation. We propose to let it go up 2 times the rate of inflation. This is not a Medicare or Medicaid cut. So when you hear all this business about cuts, let me caution you that this is not what is going on. We are going to have increases in Medicare and Medicaid and a reduction in the rate of growth." I am confused. I think this is what the Republicans are saying right now down on Capitol Hill, and yet we're getting blasted by the Democratic Congress and the President himself.
Well, may I?
Yeah, briefly.
First off, if the Republican Party has in any way given any attention to anybody with respect to the issue of training, it has been an afterthought. It has hardly been a centerpiece of the Republican agenda. If it were, it would be a part of the supposed contract for America that is still perceived in many circles as the contract on America. There's been far more conversation, indeed, by the Republican Party about what constitutes equity, this group versus that group. Let's just have a conversation for just a half a second about that. It is unreal to me that we are even engaged in the debate about pay equity, affirmative action, and the like. I have lived long enough to know what it's like not to have access to the American dream. I know what it was like not to be able to use the same water fountain, the same lunch counter, to go to the same, enjoy the same housing, or have access to the same education. And I happen to be a descendant of a people who got to this country a year before the very first pilgrims arrived, who made a contribution to this country, starting with the American Revolution, with the death and bloodshed by Crispus Attucks, who defended the American dream, even as the American dream was eluded us, denied us, legally sanctioned by the United States government, and did not become remotely a reality until 1964 and 1965. You're going to tell me that 3 decades of affirmative action offsets those many centuries of oppression and denial? It is a joke. This country also, I lived through a period when women couldn't even own property. We were property ourselves. And you're going to tell me that 3 decades of affirmative action in any way offsets that long history of denial and discrimination? We ask everybody to join the American melting pot. We say it's a Christian Judean country, we mean Christian. We say it's a melting pot, we mean white male. We've got to start being true to who we are and be a mosaic of many and embrace everybody. It is our strength. It is our advantage. And to sit up and point the finger as if a little here, a little there to offset centuries of denial and somehow is compromising this country is absurd. It is the best of what America can be. It is the promise that was articulated years ago by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. It's what they hoped we could be one day and must be if we're going to be a part of this new global society. We cannot be a strong nation divided from within. And to sit up and perpetuate this kind of conversation is to compromise the best of what America could be. So don't tell me the Republican Party stands for retraining. Don't tell me it stands for inclusion. It has never had a conversation about it in recent history. Only Abraham Lincoln was the last Republican I heard talk about it.
I'm going to let you go if you want to.
I think we need
I let it go. Okay, thanks. We're going to take our next question.
Mayor Kelly, you actually provided a perfect segue to my question. This is for the Republicans, and I'd appreciate an answer from the Democrats, too, if they'd like. Since we're talking about our future, I want to raise an issue which I think is going to greatly impact the future of this country, which is immigration policy. And in particular, I want to talk about not just undocumented immigrants, but how the rhetoric and the anger is spilling over into the legal immigration debate. Our friend Alan Simpson has introduced a bill which cuts all welfare aid to legal immigrants. Now, these are people who come to our country through legal channels. They wait years and years and years to be reunited with their families, to come here to work, and yet there are people who want to deny them what they have been waiting for. I would like a response to what Mr. Simpson has introduced.
What is it they're waiting for? Citizenship or welfare benefits?
Well, to come here and see their families and to work a job that has been offered to them.
So if they're working a job that's been offered to them, then the bill won't affect them.
There are some immigrants who come here to meet with their families and their families can't provide for them.
So then they're not coming here to work for a job that's been provided for them.
No, but we have a legal immigration system which allows people to come in two ways, either to be with family members or for employment opportunities.
The idea behind, the theory behind Simpson's bill, I think it's a valid one, is that people coming into this country are coming, like you said, to work, in which case they don't need benefits, or to be with family members, in which case their family members have invited them here, just as family members in the 1900s took in their immigrants from across the seas, and that's their line of support. The whole idea behind a lot of the changes the Republicans are proposing in all the welfare bills is to remove the entitlementality from this country and to replace government as the provider of support and benefit with family, with work, with community, and with religious organizations and civic organizations. That's the thinking behind Simpson's bill, and it's the thinking that runs through much of the rest of the welfare legislation that the Republicans have proposed.
I think your assumption is faulty. You're assuming those families can provide for their family members. And there are cases where that's not true.
So the person is coming here to be a ward of the state.
No, they're here to be with their family members.
And their family members can't provide for them.
That is often the case.
Again, the thinking there is if a family cannot provide for a new member, then it probably should try and work and build up some sort of economic stability before it begins to invite other members into this country. The point is, in general, we shouldn't look to the government to be the provider, the first-line provider of our basic needs. That should come from our community, our family, and the organizations, the voluntary organizations, such as our religious organizations, which we choose to join. It's a change in mentality from looking for the government to say you are entitled to this group of benefits, to looking to the government to help on the margins what those organizations already in the community can provide much more efficiently and with much more care and much more heart.
We have a Democratic response.
Yeah, I think John uses some rhetoric that has a lot of persuasive appeal to it, but it misses the point of her question. The point of her question is why single out legal immigrants? 2 years ago, I was reading a really leftist publication, Business Week, and about a 10-page article explaining how 10 years worth of examination of the effect immigration has on our economy indicates beyond a shadow of a doubt that immigration is good for the U.S. economy. In fact, the article went so far, the studies went so far as to suggest that not just legal immigrants, where the data was overwhelming, but even illegal aliens were generally too scared to sign up for benefits to be a drain, and in fact often pay taxes even though they didn't have to. The question John sidestepped is why single out immigrants? And it speaks to why people like me distrust people like Alan Simpson. It is a divisive thing to say, we'll balance the budget by depriving them of benefits. This is a country of immigrants. That's how it was founded. To point a finger at people who came in the 70s or 80s or 90s and say they're different than the people who came during the Great Depression is BS.
Our next question.
I have a comment and then a question for the Republicans. The comment was just, as I was listening to the opening speeches on both sides made statements to the effect of, we are the party that represents the principles of the Americans, that we represent values of Americans, which implies that the other side doesn't. And those kind of statements, I mean, I know they're common for politicians and maybe there's some reason, but I find that kind of language jarring when I'm listening to it because I think it just adds to the divisiveness that does not help debates such as this. So it's just a comment. My question is, Mr. Shaw talked about the Republicans wanting to shrink government and get government off our backs, and so I'm wondering how that jives with moves to ban abortion and to bring religion into the schools, and if you could just comment on that.
First of all, I want to comment on your comment. I don't know what my Democrats would say. But I, for one, didn't say that I don't think Democrats don't share those values, because I don't believe that. I believe they do.
You don't have to say it, but when you say that the Republicans represent the principles of...
On the contrary, I think what the real theoretical notion of a political party is that it is supposed to advance a set of principles that help us engage that process of participatory democracy that helps us go through that process of discovery and get to a national consensus. I believe both parties intend to do that. I think right now the Republicans are doing a better job of it. For exactly as the question to Sharon was, well, where does the Democrat Party stand right now? And I think they're going through the process of trying to figure it out. But on the contrary, I think both parties fundamentally share those values, and both parties are trying to serve that same process. So your comment is a very important one, and one that has to be remembered on both sides. And I don't think both parties do a very good job of it, because there's a lot of lobbing of hand grenades that I don't think is very useful. But I, for one, don't happen to believe that the Democrats are anti-American in any way. I think, on the contrary, they are not at all. In terms of less government intrusion, I don't know anybody wants to bring religion in the schools. I mean, certainly there are many in the Republican Party who believe that students ought to be allowed to pray in schools. There's certainly no imposition of religion in schools. In fact, it's quite the opposite and should never be. With respect to abortion, it may not be a surprise to most of the people in this room that abortion is a relatively divisive issue in the Republican Party, and it's going to continue to be so. But we are a party that I think can include both those who are pro-life and pro-choice, and have to continue to be so if we want to be a majority party not only in the United States House of Representatives, but a majority party in the United States. And so I don't think there is any attempts to impose beliefs on everybody in the party, or certainly every American. It's on the contrary. It's a big tent, and it has to continue to be a big tent.
We're going to move to our next question.
I'd like to follow up actually on Emily's first point. And Mr. Shaw, you said that a party represents a set of principles. And having studied government in college and then again now in graduate school, I'm constantly amazed that our country only has two parties. And I see a problem with the dichotomous situation of having only two parties in Washington. I know that when I talk to many of my fellow students here, we overlap on a lot of issues, but might not align with the same party. And I think there's an increasingly clear line of division, maybe on the Republican side between the religious right and other Republicans, maybe on the Democratic side between what might be labeled as more conservative Democrats and more liberal Democrats. And I wonder if both sides of the panel, I admire and almost envy your confidence or your being so sure that you fit into one of these two bins. But if you could maybe each side could talk a little bit about what are some of the overlaps, what are issues where there might be consensus, and even if you don't think there could be a third or more parties, where do you think party politics might not have to play such a big role in some of the more pressing debates right now?
Before the two sides respond, I'm just going to respectfully ask that both sides limit their comments so we can get a couple more questions in before concluding remarks.
I'm going to give 10 seconds as a political scientist and then 10 seconds as a Republican. We as Republicans certainly have not forgotten that it has not always been a two-party country and that we were not always the other party. The last third-party candidate in America to be elected President of the United States was Abraham Lincoln. I mean, we began as a third party that got rid of the other second party. Remember the Whigs? I mean, they're sort of forgotten to history now. So we were one of those third parties who knocked out party number 2 and became the alternative party. So on the contrary, it doesn't always fit. So I'm not pretending that you get some easy, bifurcation in American politics. It doesn't happen at all. Not 100% of the things the Republican Party stands for do I agree with, and I was a candidate for Congress of that party, so it doesn't happen. Now, as a partisan, I think much more was your important part of your question is, where are the areas of agreement? Well, one area of agreement, but I'm not going to demagogue the heck out of it, is retraining. Sharon is exactly right, and we began that debate in 1992. And we put that bill up in 1992, and the Democrats in Congress didn't want to pass it. They didn't want to give Republicans a political victory in an election year. Fine, I understand that. Robert Reich, who was one of my professors when I was a student here, came along, and that bill is 95%. I mean, paragraph by paragraph, what we put together in the Assets Bill in 1992, which is terrific. That's how it should happen. I don't care if the Democrats get credit for it. Let's go from there. Because what's important is 10 years from now, America looks very different, and it's a very different economy. Yes, those types of investments, Sharon could not be more right, is exactly the thing to do. Democrats and Republicans better agree, because that's our economic security for the next century, and that's one terrific area where there is common ground, and we should stop lobbing hand grenades and do some of the reasonable and important work for the future.
Mayor Kelly?
As a Democrat who did believe in some of the following: one, downsizing, privatizing in certain areas. I do think sometimes government regulation is intrusive in terms of our free enterprise system, and I do think we need to check that. And further, I am one who believes there should be a legitimate debate about even vouchers. I think we have got to deal with the logjam that exists in our public school system and bring in some new energy, and I'm prepared to do it by considering a debate around such issues as voucher. My concern, and Paul's with the Republican Party, is the same as Rudy's. I get nervous when I hear these conversations, I think, that hurt the least of these.
Our next question, please.
Good evening. I have a comment and a question. First, a comment about immigration. I don't need to see a showing of hands, but I'd like a number of you to think about who among you had ancestors come here before the 1930s. And then I'd like you to think of all the welfare programs that were waiting for them when they came prior to the 1930s. And you can probably count those on your right hand or left hand without using any fingers. My question is, Mayor Kelly, ma'am, if you believe we need to, quote, and I took quite a few number of notes, as you can see, we need quote, desperate reform, and we need to downsize, reorganize, and rethink the role of government. Why does President Clinton's budget run $200 billion more than we can afford every year? Maybe Dimitri will want to answer that. I don't know. He seems to be pretty excited. And if Rudy said we cut $400 billion off the deficit, I imagine, where are those savings today?
Go ahead.
Actually, the Clinton budget would be in balance if we didn't have to pay debt on the budget run up by a previous president.
If that's the case, then how come the budget has been out of balance every year since President Kennedy was in charge?
Oh, sure, the budget was out of balance, but all the budget deficits up to Reagan were a pittance compared to what was run up because he believed in the academic policies of a laugher. A guy named Laffer, who thought that you could cut taxes and raise money. One of many academics used by the Republicans to justify cutting benefits for the poor and giving benefits to the wealthy.
Well, if we keep in mind, too, that all bills originated in the House, and the president didn't write any of those bills that added to the debt. You might want to keep that in mind.
I think Jim wants to respond.
I have a response to Dimitri's claims about the debt prior to President Clinton. It's strange to me to hear that all of this deficit spending was blamed on a president. After all, it is the Congress that appropriates every single dollar that the United States government spends. And then with regard to Art Laffer, whether he's right or wrong, the fact is that in the 1980s, more revenue after those tax cuts came into the United States Treasury. It's just that more spending went out. So let's get our facts right before we debate the merits of it.
We'll move to our next question.
Okay. A little short. Given that affirmative action may not be the best way to right the unequal racial representation in the workplace, what other substantial efforts do the party suggest to correct the imbalances in race and class power without breaking the budget? This is for both.
Well, I happen to think I don't understand how affirmative action, one, has harmed America's budget, number one.
Excuse me, the question is not about
It works
affirmative
on that
action.
assumption. What else might be?
I'm saying if that's a completely different issue, I'm gonna, for purposes
Okay.
of the question, try to ignore affirmative action if you can, to think of another method that might be useful.
I'm at a loss. Because affirmative action is only an affirmative way to offset a prejudice that has been inculcated in the psyche of America, and it in no way is a quota that people were concerned about. It is merely an aggressive effort to offset something that is very harmful to this country. I'm at a loss to understand what more or what less could be done, and am troubled really by the debate.
I think there are two things we have to consider. One is, after 30 years of affirmative action, which I think there are legitimate points that can be made against it and legitimate points that can be made for it. But one thing that has to be said is, has it really helped the communities it was meant to serve? Have the black community prospered?
But excuse me, but my question is, assuming that the affirmative, given that affirmative action may not be good, do you have another idea?
Make good sense, which is affirmative action has not been a solution to helping increase opportunity. I think the solution is to create the opportunity state that Jack Kemp speaks of. And to that end, to try and reduce the barriers to opportunity that exist today. And you can look around and find them very quickly. Excessive rates of taxation in our inner cities, laws that favor mainly suburban white unions, such as Davis-Bacon, and discriminate against inner city minority workers, minimum wage laws that prevent students from finding jobs. All these barriers against the free market operating to its optimum level are things that can be taken down and increase opportunity, and increase the ability of people to climb out of what has been created, an underclass, and climb into recreate our middle class in America.
There's a great misperception there, may I say, that since the early 60s, of all the socioeconomic groupings, the greater number of African Americans ended up in the middle class. Now, I know that the picture you get on the nightly news is that the lion's share in the quote-unquote underclass. That is not true. The most limited window of opportunity, and people move to the middle class. There is an underclass in America, the overriding percentage of which happens not to be people of color. It happens to be people who are white. Unfortunately, this country, too much of this country, still the defining issue is race. And so people present welfare as if it were overwhelmingly an issue of color. It is overwhelmingly an issue of people who happen to be white. They introduce the issue of illegitimacy the same way. The majority of the young women who are having babies out of wedlock happen to be white. They present affirmative action as if the principal beneficiaries happen to be people of color. Primary beneficiaries happen to be women, in most instances, women who are white. There's a lot of misperceptions out there, a lot of inaccuracies out there, and it goes back to the person who asked the question about the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. We don't engage in honest dialogue. We engage in finger pointing and covering the rear. We don't have honest discussions. We've got to have some honest discussions around issues as pivotal as these. And to think that people as informed as you would not know that the lion's share of the people have ended up in the middle class, or that the lion's share are not in the underclass, or to sit up and misrepresent the fact that it has not worked, it speaks volumes about the urgency of honest dialogue.
Mayor Kellum, so we're going to have to move on, but I'm going to offer the Republicans.
Yeah, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics just last week, women are contributing 41% of all household earnings. Now, I cite that statistic because I'm confused, Mayor Kelly. In the beginning, you criticized my comments because you said that how can I talk about affirmative action when people have been discriminated against for decades. My actual comment was that affirmative action has had its day simply for the very statistics you just cited. You just told us of the benefits that most middle-class people are now minority, or are more minorities in the middle class than the underclass. It's not a majority in the underclass of minorities. It's actually whites. So where is the reasoning?
We'll take our next question.
Yeah, I'm confused about the Republican agenda here. You have the contract for America that says that you're going to cut the budget deficit. It seems that all the rhetoric has been blaming the budget deficit on welfare mothers, school lunch programs, etc. But what has the Republican Party actually done to address the issue of Social Security? The fact that most people who are, the wealthy elderly who are collecting Social Security, have probably used up the amount they actually put in within a period of 5 to 7 years. I don't have the exact figures at hand, but it seems that all the problems are blamed on welfare mothers, school lunch for kids, immigrants. But can you talk to us about what you're going to do about Social Security problem?
I'm going to say one word about the budget deficit and attempts to balance it in 7 years. Democrats, you can't have it both ways. You can't keep saying, why do you single out these folks? Why do you single out these folks? Why do you've said that 10 times here in the last hour. The fact is, when you're coming up with $1.4 trillion in savings in 7 years, you haven't singled out anybody, you've cut everybody. And that's basically what you see in this budget. Yeah, there is some distributed sacrifice everywhere. Now, we as a party believe that we can balance the budget in 7 years by having, and still have a very clear message on Social Security, and that is, federal government, keep your hands off the Social Security Trust Fund. It isn't your money to spend. That was a bargain that American workers made with their government, and they get retirement benefits. And we put a proposal together that does cut $1.4 trillion over 7 years. That gets to zero without touching Social Security. And it is very easy for us to have the discussion we've had for an hour and go through every one of those proposals and why, well, they all have something good to them. We don't have lots of really, truly dreadful money in the federal government that doesn't do any good for anybody. Yeah, it does something. The fact is, though, we're still talking about just the Republican plan because there is no Democrat alternative. And that's where we are. Yeah, we believe we can do it without cutting Social Security, and we'll do it in 7 years. And if the Democrats have some better ideas, we are ready and willing to accept them at the table. I should point out, the one thing the House Republicans have done, the first time in decades and decades and decades, this stuff comes to the floor of the Congress with an open rule. You get to offer amendments. You have a better idea, boy, do we ever want to hear it. We Republicans could never do that under the Democrat majority. So we're waiting for those better ideas. In the meantime, both the House and the Senate Republicans have come up with a 7-year plan to get to zero without touching Social Security.
Rudy, do you have a better idea?
2 quick points. I think both parties have failed to really step up to the plate on the issue of Social Security. On the other hand, President Clinton in his '93 budget actually instituted and made part of the law a form of means testing for Social Security. In other words, he made a portion of benefits taxable for the higher income recipients. The Republicans call that a tax hike and are getting ready to repeal it. Here's a little quote from yesterday's Wall Street Journal, another leftist publication I like to read, that speaks to, John Shaw makes a good point. We can't just gripe about what Republicans are doing, though it's a lot of fun. But it's where their priorities are that scares me. Here's the quote. Attempt to end business breaks fails in Congress. Estimates vary on exactly how much the government gives up in revenue as a result of corporate tax breaks, but most budget experts say it exceeds $200 billion over 5 years. Here's what failed to pass the Republican Congress. A cut of $25 billion over 7 years. That would be a whopping 9% annual cut. They did, however, find the political will to take 15% out of Medicaid, 30% out of Medicare, and 30% out of domestic discretionary spending, which is the stuff like student loans. So it's where the priorities are that is what I'm talking about.
Rudy, I'm going to move to our last question because we've got to move on to closing statements. Gary, you've got the last word as a questioner. Please be brief, and panelists, please be brief.
Sure, I'll try and be brief. I want to get back to something we talked about a little bit before, and that was a lot of talk from particularly the Republicans about returning to a holistic America, talking about returning to its roots in the party of Lincoln. Jim, in his speech, addressed some inner city issues in which, as a person of color who's particularly here because he's concerned about other people of color, I'm heartened by that. But at the same time, I'm a little concerned that it's the wolf in sheep's clothing when I hear the specific policies about the earned income tax credit, affirmative action, and job training, for example, and that these are things that I think will help those most vulnerable in society, particularly people of color, and seem to counteract what I think, Jim, what you talked about, this equity and opportunity. These are programs that will create that opportunity. And at the same time, the concern from the Republicans that is addressed towards people of color tends to be, I think, rather paternalistic. It tends not to be consultative. There isn't a lot of consultation with people of color within the Republican Party. There's not a lot of real, genuine, honest reaching out to people of color that I see. And I don't mean to say that, I mean, I don't mean to accuse you, but I just want some response to that about what the GOP can do or is doing, or really what the real commitment is to reaching out to all of America.
Gary, it's a good point. And let's face it, there are not as many African Americans, for example, in the Republican Party. My absolute determination is to persuade and ask why I would love, my dream is to go into a minority community and persuade people to join the Republican Party. And I say that, you can laugh, but I say that because I don't see it as paternalistic. I mean, enterprise zones are not paternalistic. Instead of having the subsidy in the form of public housing, but instead offering ownership of an apartment is far from paternalistic. It is saying to people that have never owned a home, you can participate, one-time favor only, in the capitalist system. You can sell your apartment when you want to move or for whatever other reason, perhaps getting a capital gain. But then again, if we have a tax on that capital gain, maybe that's not possible.
Do we have a Democratic response? Okay. Well, at this point, we're going to...
I think Mayor Kelly has talked enough about that.
At this point, we're going to move to concluding remarks. Dimitri Melhone will start first for the Democratic side.
The debate thus far has seemed to come down to two broad categories of issues. The Republicans, first of all, present themselves as these hard-nosed pragmatists that are going to come in and solve the problems. They're going to get the job done. And on the other hand, they're going to maintain the concern for economic justice and inclusion that has always marked the Democratic Party, as Mayor Kelly pointed out. I want to deal with the pragmatism types of issues first because I think they're the easiest to dismiss. Someone said, and I don't know who, that Republicans say the government doesn't work and then they get into office and prove it. And I think that their argument that the Democrats are responsible for all these boondoggles and wasted money are preposterous when we think about things like the expensive and ineffective crime policies that they advocate, such as interdiction into the third world and the death penalty. And we think about the haphazard deregulation of S&Ls during the Reagan administration that cost us substantial amounts of money compared to the much more measured cutting back of government under President Clinton. And when we think about the types of corporate tax breaks that both Jim and Rudy have talked about, we see the Republicans spend a ton of money on wasted causes. They're not hard-nosed pragmatists unless the person under the knife happens to be powerless. The other thing that the Republicans tend to talk about is federalism. And that's something that I love. And I especially love having these talks with Jim about how great it would be if the states took over all these policies of welfare and education. The problem is the Republicans are resurgent at the state level too. And they're devolving welfare and education down still further. So when we talk about devolving things down to the states so that the states are all of a sudden going to take up welfare and education, the thing is you look at governors like Weld and Wilson, they're cutting welfare and education too. It's getting devolved down to the individual. And the individual, in many cases, can't do anything about it. And the third thing about this hard-nosed pragmatism, it seems like the Republicans ignore basic economic reality about public goods, like infrastructure and education investment that Clinton and many Democratic governors keep proposing that keep getting attacked and shot down by the Republicans. So this whole hard-nosed bit, I'm not saying that either party is economically brilliant. Both of them are political, but one is no better than the other. But where one is better than the other is on issues of justice and inclusion. And there's been a lot of talk about what the Democrats stand for as opposed to what they attack. And we are a battered party, I admit that. We've been governing for a long time, and it's been distracting. But we have always stood for principles of justice and inclusion. And that is the one thing that the Republicans have never stood. So no matter how appealing their cool ideological tricks like school vouchers, those are neat things, fun. You know, a lot of fun can be had arguing about those things, but you know, that's not economic justice. And particularly, when we talk about inclusion and economic justice, there are two issues. One is the policies, and the policies divide up very neatly. It's a very neat division between the parties. One party at both the state and the federal level wants to cut education, cut Medicaid, allow billions of dollars in corporate tax subsidies, tax cuts for the wealthy, cut welfare regardless of the efficacy of the particular program or the evidence for dependency, cut environmental protection, hurting future generations, cut benefits for legal aliens and for illegal ones, deny women rights to abortions, and try to roll back, I think, decades of progress on racial issues. They attack affirmative action. Affirmative action may be unjust, but they also attack the alternative to affirmative action, which is education. So on the policy issue, you see a very neat division between the two parties. The Democrats consistently defend the interests of the poor, children, future generations. In other words, those who are not well politically represented. And when you look at actually instead of just the policies, but the discourse, the rhetoric in the campaigns, the division is even more extreme. You have Barney Fagg and Willie Horton. You have right-wing hate radio. You have a family values campaign. You have arguments about immigration where you talk about immigrants who are generally better educated than natives coming here for welfare. And that's why we need to cut them off from any sort of insurance or safety net, because otherwise they'll come here for welfare. That's the kind of rhetoric. And it's not that the Republicans here are bad. In fact, this message is to the Republicans because I agree with you. And we all agree on the same things we want. We all want economic justice, and we all want to use economically efficient means to achieve those ends. We all have the same vision for society. But which party can you trust? Which party has built up its entire electoral machine around the politics of hate and fear, around demagoguery? I mean, we're demagogues too, I admit it. But look at the scapegoats we choose. We attack the national health insurance industry. We don't attack immigrants. And that is why I am a Democrat. And that is why I think that even though at the moment we are a beaten party, we will continue to be the party of the future, because we will always defend economic justice.
Thank you, Dimitri. John Simon from the Republican side will have the last word.
I'll spend a few moments responding to Dimitri. I do have the last word, so I'm free of rebuttal. And as such, with that type of power, and as a Republican, I want to be wary of using that power. So I do not want to spend too much time shooting Dimitri down without a response. I just want to point out that many of these extremist points, the Republicans do have an agenda, as John Shaw has pointed out. I don't know where you find these extremist points in the Contract with America. And as far as the budget, it spreads the pain to Medicare, a middle-class entitlement. It cuts $30 billion in corporate subsidies, and it cuts $170 billion actually of transfer payments from taxpayers to the rich, otherwise known as interest on our debt. So to that extent, the extremist points you brought up are not represented in the two items, the Contract for America and the Domenici and Kasich budget plans, which are really the embodiment of the Republican agenda. Now, I want to go back and harken back to last week when Robert Reich was in this chair, or maybe it was in that chair, I'm not sure, and he made the point, if the debate is about the size of government, then the Republicans win. But if the debate is about how you can get ahead, then we have a chance, implying that government can help you get ahead. Now again, I don't want to abuse my power, so I don't want to focus on the issue on which we clearly win, the size of government. I want to talk about this issue of government helping you get ahead. This is basically the candy store philosophy of government. It's that government can give out goodies to you, and goodies to you, and goodies to you, and can help all of us improve ourselves, and give us something that we don't have. There are several problems with this view of government, and I'll just mention 4 of them. One is, what is it that government has that it is giving to us that'll help us improve ourselves? Is it expertise? If there's anyone here who wants to defend the proposition that a Washington bureaucrat knows more about your business or your career or your life, I'm willing to lay odds that that person probably doesn't have much of a business or a career or a life. The fact of the matter is, the people who know most about what to do with their life are the American people. And we have to give them as much rope as we can provide to make the choices on what to do with that. The other thing, but usually it's not expertise that the candy store Democrats are talking about when they're talking about what they can do for you. Usually what they're talking about is resources. The problem is the government doesn't have any resources except what it takes from you. So if it is giving you something to help you improve it yourself, it has already taken that from you, paid a little to cover its own overhead expense, and given you back less. Now, of course, some might say, well, it didn't really take it from me. It took it from that other guy who deserves it much less than I do. And sometimes they're probably right. Some of these other people deserve it less than you do. But a tenet of our capitalistic society, and I think we can agree that we are still a capitalistic society, is that most people produce more for society, consumer surplus, than they get back in compensation, and that they work hard to do that. So when you are taking from somebody to give to somebody else, you are decreasing the incentive for someone to produce something worthwhile for society, for a benefit that is fairly intangible. Moreover, that person, now you've made one person better off, helped him improve himself, maybe with someone else's money, but someone else is worse off. So now you have to go to that person and say, we're going to help you improve yourself. Government is going to help you get ahead. And when government when government tries to help you, they'll be taken from someone else. And the government's going to go to the person next to you and say, we're going to help you. And it's a cycle that we've been in for 30 years, and basically it's been shifted from one person to the other until we found someone who really can't complain, and that's our future generations. And and we have piled up debt on our future generations to the point where it will be backbreaking, as Pete Peterson pointed out in his speech here last night. We have made promises we just can't keep. The final problem that I see in this candy store mentality of government is that it creates a mindset. It tells the American people, you can't do it on your own. You need government to help you. You are the victim of forces which are far out of your control. And until government shows up, you better hunker down, don't look over the windowsill, don't take any chances, and wait till government to provide you with some program that'll move you on. Because government is what helps you get ahead, not you. Basically, the Republican agenda, and it's not just the legislatures, by the way, that are making these promises. It's also the courts, which are saying, we can help you get ahead. If you sue someone because someone gave you a bad paint job on your BMW, we can help you by giving you $4 million. And no one pays, really, except, of course, the consumers and the stockholders, who are us, the American people. Now, the Republican agenda, in terms of tort reform, in terms of a line item veto, in terms of a balanced budget amendment, and in terms of 2 budget plans that get us to a balanced budget in 7 years, begins a process of weaning us off the governmental candy, of turning us from a country that has an entitlement mentality to a country that has an opportunity mentality. The fact of the matter is that as what John Shaw said was true, this pain will be hard, but it is spread out. And particularly, one area I want to focus on is welfare, where we do not have enough money. We would never have enough money to guarantee everyone a middle-class income. Now, if you take the total national income and divide it up among all of us, it's $60,000 a year. Sounds pretty good. But how long would our total national income support everyone living at $60,000 a year without doing anything? We do have enough money, though, and we have spent it so, to keep a sizable portion of our population in abject poverty, denying them of any ability to move out, any incentive to save, any incentive to work. Grace Capitello was a welfare mother who had the dream of sending her daughter to college. She saved diligently every day. She went to discount stores to buy toys. She went to she cut off the, when her daughter grew out of her clothes, she sewed them up and made new ones out of the old ones. And when her caseworker found out that she had saved $3,000, they threw her off the welfare rolls and sued her for not just the $3,000 that she had saved, but for all the money she had collected in welfare since she started to save more than the legal limit of $1,000, which was $15,000. A governmental system cannot provide the type of compassion that or social justice that the Democrats are talking about. Woodrow Wilson said, we have to face the fact that we are in an economic system which has no heart. And I believe he was right in the 1920s and in the 19-teens. But today, our government bureaucracy also has no heart. It is a government of 250 million people. It cannot cater to the needs of all 250 million of them. Our government has done wonderful things. It has stared down totalitarianism 4 times in this century. It has created great social goods, conquered diseases, come to the aid of people in dire need because of natural disaster. But in each of those instances, it didn't say to Americans, this will help you get ahead. It said to Americans, this is a sacrifice. This is going to cost you treasure and maybe your life. And that is the way that government should conduct its business before the American people. And I think that the candy store philosophy of government is a demeaning way of government going about its business. Now I realize that weaning us off the governmental candy will be difficult and it will be painful, and we can't cut welfare without having something else there. We've talked about one of the things that we want, that one leg that we want to support people on, which is increasing opportunity. And that's part of tax cuts, that's part of moving down regulations, that's part of creating enterprise zones, and that's part of using the economic forces which are in our country, whether we like them or not, for our good. But of course, that can't be the whole answer because of what Woodrow Wilson said. Our economic system has no heart, and it cannot address the issue of justice. And that's where the social conservatives come in as a very important part of the Republican Party, because they make us realize that we can care for our people, that there are lots of different forms of government in our society. There is a coercive government that has the power to tax, our federal government, our state government, and our local government, but there's also our family, which is a government, which commands our obedience. There is our community, which is a government, which commands our obedience. There's our church, our synagogue. There are a whole host of organizations out there which are much better suited to be the front line of helping you get ahead, of where your abilities and where the free market conspires against you. These organizations can help you move forward.
John, I'm going to have to ask you
to
close soon.
The question before us is, will the Republican agenda lead to a better America? It depends what type of America you would consider better. But if you believe that people should stand on their own feet, if you believe that people should turn to their friends and family before government for help, if you believe that government should be respected and can be respected without being encumbered by promises which it just can't keep, and if you believe that opportunity, not redistribution of wealth, is the best engine for improving people's economic standing, then the answer is the Republican agenda will lead us to a better America.
I want to thank all our panelists with a special note of thanks to Mayor Kelly and John Schall and all the student panelists and for the audience participation. Appreciate you making this a successful event.
I'm sorry I said BS then.
It was good.